Welcome to The Roommate Coach. My name is Mark Lynn, and I'll be your host here on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. So, you've got a new roommate. Maybe it's someone you've known for a while and you decided to become roommates. Maybe it's a complete stranger that you were assigned. But one way or another, there's this new person that now you have to get along with, and your fates are intertwined, for better or for worse, at least for some period of time. So, is there anything you can do now, early on, to give this new relationship, that's what it is, a better chance of working? That's the topic for today, and that's what I, as the roommate coach, am going to talk about. So, let's get started. I will admit to being a little undecided as to what to list as the first most important thing about a new roommate, about getting things to work well. I'm torn between talking about goodwill, establishing goodwill, which of course is essential, and the other thing that I think needs to happen really early in the game is just simply acknowledging the fact that roommate problems are a big deal. It's usually tempting, or it's sometimes tempting, to ignore something that might go wrong, even when we know there's statistically a pretty good chance that it will, because roommate troubles happen a lot, as we know. But it's kind of a magical thinking type thing to ignore it. I think it's better to just kind of put it out there, and that way you sort of take some of the sting out of it, or some of the surprise, and I think it's a little more likely. The goal is to get everybody involved to be speaking as candidly and honestly as possible from the very beginning. And the more the conversation centers around plain old reality, even when it's a little touchy and maybe a little uncomfortable, the better chance there is of that happening. I guess I've kind of answered my own question. I guess I'd suggest doing both, is starting out by just opening a discussion about the issue of roommate problems and the fact that you and your roommates really want to do everything you can to minimize them, but at the same time, do all of that with as much goodwill as possible. So it's really not either or. It's start from the basics and do it with goodwill. What I try for really in all of my transactions, whether it's roommates or a commercial transaction, buying something or dealing with someone in a restaurant, whatever, is I always go for the idea that, hey, we're on the same side here. Because most of the time, I mean, I guess there are exceptions. If you're in a war, maybe you're not on the same side. Although there are even exceptions to that, come to think of it. Just a sneak preview in passing, somewhere when we get close to Christmas time, I intend to talk about the World War I Christmas truce. But that's just an aside. I'll stick to the topic here, I promise. So most of the time, it's in dealings with others, you really are on the same side, and in roommates, it's certainly the case. Like I've said before, you need each other. You're counting on each other to share expenses and share the work, and just share all the responsibilities, and hopefully some of the fun as well of living, of going about your business. And this attitude can be, and should be, I would argue, should be established from the very beginning. So in talking about the simple fact that, hey, we know roommates sometimes have trouble, and we want to nip this in the bud and get off on the right track here, that's, I think, a perfect example of being on the same side, and hey, we're in this together. So the sooner you can establish the attitude that whatever happens, and sometimes when your interests do clash with each other, maybe you both want to use the kitchen at the same time or whatever. If you maintain that attitude that the most important thing here is getting it to work so that we both wind up reasonably happy, then it's a lot more likely that you'll come up with a pretty fair compromise. So that's how I would resolve that question that I had, is I'd say start out by discussing just the simple reality of roommate problems, do it with as much goodwill as possible, and approach it with the idea that, hey, it's really in all of our interest, both depending on how many of you there are, obviously. It's in our best interest to get this thing to work as well as it can. Okay, some more specifics now. Here's something you can do after you've begun by discussing, by just everybody acknowledging that, yeah, we know that lots of times roommates have trouble, and we want to have as little trouble as possible. You kind of get everyone's buy-in, as they say. So, like I said, goodwill is important, and one thing that can really help with goodwill, if it's used properly, is humor. And in this case, you can use humor really effectively to maybe get some information out there that can be useful. What you can do is, and the idea too, a good idea for anything that may be a little unusual or a little something people aren't familiar with, is to be willing to go first. So what you might try is, hey, I have an idea. Let's say you're talking to your roommate. Say there's 3 of you. What if we go around and take turns, and I'll go first, and I will try to come up with some ways that I might screw this thing up. And you say it lightheartedly, and you kind of laugh, but at the same time, you're kind of serious. The idea, I think, is to sort of remove some of the power that I think we all have those inner parts that maybe are looking to make a little trouble. We all talk about our secret selves and everything. So kind of bringing some of that out into the open and maybe making it a little bit lighthearted. You can even use the sentence completion technique. It's something that I learned when I was in therapy years ago with Nathaniel Brandon. He used it a lot, and others have done the same thing. Is you start out with a sentence stem, and then you just complete it. You could say, one of the ways I might louse things up for myself and my roommates is, and you might add it by, I'll forget to wash the dishes. And another way I might louse things up around here could be, I'll spend all my money gambling and not be able to pay my share of the rent. And again, if you go first and you try to keep it light, and you're not there to pick on each other or give each other a bad time. You're just kind of trying to get things out. Some of the things that might go wrong. It's almost like when you carry a spare tire. It's not that you're looking to have a flat, but you recognize that flats do happen, so why not be prepared? You're listening to The Roommate Coach on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. I'm Mark Lynn, and if you want to leave any comments or questions or feedback for me, you can do so at theroommatecoach.com, or you could leave a voicemail at local number 707-362-8000. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, what good does it do for us to tell each other of all the rotten habits that we have and how we're going to louse things up? And that seems like a pretty reasonable question. I can kind of wonder that myself until I stop and think about it. I think one of the biggest problems, we all do things that are going to bug somebody. There's no such thing as ideal behavior. If you're 100% neat about everything you do, your behavior is going to bug someone that is uncomfortable when things are too neat, and vice versa. So perfection doesn't exist. We know that. So it's more the question of how do we best handle the inevitable things that come up. I think the worst thing that happens is frequently what happens between people, as soon as someone does something we don't like, we tend to turn them into the enemy and basically withdraw from them emotionally. And at that point, we become strangers, and it's awfully hard to reconcile things when there's no real connection, no real human connection. Now, if this is strangers, if it's someone on the street, well, it doesn't really matter that much because you're really not that important to each other in some cosmic way, I guess you are, but on a day-to-day basis, no. With roommates, you are. You got to live together. You're counting on each other. So the important thing to me about acknowledging some of our own imperfections and getting them out in the open and making it okay to talk about them is it makes it a lot more likely that when, not if, but when you do in fact do something that bugs somebody else, it's a little more likely that they will be willing and able to just tell you about it without getting mad at you and without becoming your enemy and turning it into a war. And when that happens, when someone approaches you with friendliness, it's a lot more likely that you will attempt to change your behavior. Now, if we combine all of this with some good old-fashioned tolerance, which is another topic I'll discuss in a little while, there's a good chance that maybe we can get along, or at least get along better than we sometimes do. So now that we've talked about some of the bad things we're likely to do, although with some humor and some goodwill and hopefully with a willingness to try our darndest to do something about it where possible, the next step, or a logical next step, would be for the various roommates to take turns talking about things that are really important to them. What are the various deal breakers? Now, this is an important discussion to have, and again, I can't emphasize the goodwill enough, because that's the part that'll make it or break it, in my opinion. But it's also important to be realistic about what you put on your list, and I guess what you are willing to enforce. Kind of goes hand in hand with my next topic here, which is tolerance. Another way to say it is the old pick your battles. So being realistic and deciding what is really important, that something has to be not below a certain point, let's say. Maybe it's housekeeping, maybe it's noise, maybe your sleep is really important to you for various health reasons or whatever. So maybe not being disturbed when you're sleeping is a crucial thing. Whatever it happens to be, if it's realistic, put that on your list and talk about it. And from there, especially, now here's where it might become really interesting, is let's say one of your roommates has talked about in the prior section about how they might screw things up. Maybe one of them says, well, I'm really a lousy housekeeper. I can relate to that. That's one of my own failings, as a matter of fact. And on your list, you're making your list, and this is one of your knockout factors, is you just can't stand it when things are messy. Well, this gives you an opportunity, especially with the goodwill that's been established, to talk to each other, and maybe not as part of the same conversation, but to agree to talk it out and hopefully come up with some kind of an arrangement where you both get what you want. Maybe you reach some kind of a compromise. Maybe you come up with some kind of a trade, something. Like I say, there's no guarantee, there's no magic, and sometimes in life we're going to be disappointed and there's just nothing to be done for it. I don't think utopia exists, except maybe in some science fiction stories. But with the as long as you're on the same side, and as long as you can maintain the goodwill and do whatever you can to keep things from turning into a battle, even when you're really at odds with each other, even when your drop dead list or your showstopper list, the number one thing on it might be the same thing that your roommate just got through saying they've got a real hard time with. If you've got some goodwill between you, you have a chance of working out something that works for both of you. Without the goodwill, and when it turns into a battle and name-calling, then at that point it's pretty hopeless. There are several more things that you can do to get things started off well with new roommates, and I will discuss those in my next show. However, right now I'd like to go off in a slightly different direction, just a couple of comments here. One is I received a really nice feedback on my voicemail line, the 707-362-8000, from a local listener, a fellow. Didn't leave a name or anything, so I can't thank you by name, but whoever you are, I really appreciate the call. That definitely made my day. I'm glad to know someone is listening and that someone is finding this useful. My hope is for the show to get better and better as time goes by. I'm just kind of getting started right now, and I know there are some rough edges, but I am going to do everything I can to make it as good and useful as possible. So thank you again for that. The other thing I want to mention briefly, in listening to my own words of wisdom here, I realize that some of this might sound kind of naive. This is something I'll come back to from time to time because it definitely bears repeating. It would be easy for someone to think that, well, gosh, this guy's just living in la-la land where everybody's nice and nobody has any trouble. That's most emphatically not the case. I live in the world, and I have had my share of problems starting pretty early in life. I know that some people can be quite difficult to get along with for a variety of reasons. There was a time when I had some of my own irrational behavior, I'm sorry to say, although I will admit I've taken steps to improve things. So I'm not saying that this stuff is easy, and yeah, a lot of the things I suggest initially, even if they don't sound impossible to you, the listener, there's a good chance that if you, like today's topic, for example, if you sit down with your new roommates and you suggest some of the things I'm suggesting, in some cases they may not be too interested, to put it nicely. So, but let's face it, if everyone was already doing everything that it took to have a peaceful, rational world, guess what? We would have a peaceful and rational world. So obviously something needs to change, and I think we all know that change doesn't happen immediately and usually doesn't happen without some resistance. So that, anyway, I will need to repeat that from time to time because I'm sure it's a fairly easily understood reaction to what I'm saying here. So anyway, that will be it for this episode 3 of The Roommate Coach, which I'm going to give it the episode title of The New Roommate Part 1. And once again, this is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. And I'd like to thank Access Humboldt, and specifically Matt Knight at Access Humboldt, for getting this station on the air and giving me the opportunity to do my stuff here with The Roommate Coach. I really appreciate it. You can reach Access Humboldt at accesshumboldt.net, spelled pretty much the way it sounds, and with Google, even if you just get close, you'll find it. And if you want to leave me any questions or comments or feedback, you can use the contact link at theroommatecoach.com. You can also leave a voicemail at area 707-362-8000. My bumper music is called Rollin' at 5 by Kevin MacLeod. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and let's all look forward to episode 4. Thank you.